Welcome, everyone, to another exciting adventure on Riding Through the Unknown. I'm your host, Michael, and today's guest I have been having great conversation with, and we've been kind of laughing it up a little bit too to kind of ease into today. And he brings a lot of great topics, and we will do our best to try and flow into all of them, and whatever we can't, I feel confident we can cover in another episode. And I know, I normally don't speak that ahead of time, but that's how much belief I have in this guest and the knowledge that he's bringing and the excitement behind it. And I want to thank everyone that's in the chat room that's already, starting to comment and watching. And so I'm going to stop rambling on to give our guest more time. And we discussed this behind the stage, and I am not going to butcher his last name. I am instead going to say, I'm going to turn it over to my amazing guest, the one, the only experiencer, wisdom keeper, and insightful Alexander.
Thank you for having me on. I wanted to say that I was excited before our conversation, but right now I'm even more excited after saying this cinematic intro. It was epic. Thank you. Aleksander Czeszkiewicz.
Yeah, see, that's why I said I am not going to do that last name. And
Don't worry.
I gotta say though, as it goes with names, I like how your body goes in and moves with the you're saying it. It's like it's not just a word. It's like it's a energy and everything with it. And so that's really cool and fun to watch. But for those that are watching, I do believe, if memory serves right, because we started talking a little while ago, and I've been having kind of a busy schedule, but you reached out to me about being on the show. And when we were talking about topics, I was like, oh my gosh, you like hit so many that I'm like, oh, I love this topic. And you asked me, like, Will, which one do you want to start on? I'm like, I don't know. They're all so great. But so while we decide which one we're going to start on, could you give a little bit of background as to who you are for the audience, please?
Yes, my name is Aleksander Czeszkiewicz, and I'm a Polish researcher and author of Deja Vu Has Everything Already Been. And I first wrote this book just at the age of 17, and it's like 400 pages something, so it's pretty, maybe not heavy, but it's a pretty decent book. I got a few compliments from other authors, so I started very early this journey into, some would say, alternative history, lost civilizations, also mysteries of the entire universe, reality, and so on at a very early age, because I was basically bored to some extent. The answers that I was given when it comes to textbooks, when it comes to the educational system were not enough for me. It wasn't enough when I was learning about history, when I was learning about biology, physics. I had a deep feeling that there is something more to everything about our universe, and that's how I started going beyond what was only in the curriculum, what was beyond science. I thought to myself, how do we know that ancient Sumerians were, for instance, the first civilizations, as I was learning? How do we know that before there were these and this hominids? And how do we know our history turned in this way and not the other? And I started digging deeper and deeper into not only mainstream stuff, but also alternative history, also ancestral narratives about what our ancient ancestors were thinking about the history as a whole, how they viewed it. And that's how my journey started. parallel to that, that's why I'm also talking about spiritual stuff, paranormal, psychic, and so on, because parallel to this journey, and this initial journey in research led to me writing this book at the age of 17, but parallel to that, I would say I had some kind of spiritual awakening, or I started being more and more spiritual. I started having things that can be considered paranormal, and this was my journey to, just to paint the picture.
No, that's amazing. And to me, it's amazing that at 17, to be able to write a book about such a heavy topic is impressive. And the fact that instead of being bored and just being like, and just deciding, I'll just, chill or do this or that, that you were like, no, I'm bored. So I'm going to go learn. I'm going to go read about this or that. And so that's a testament, I think, that not many people have anymore. And so I just want to acknowledge that to you, that that is really cool that you did that and had the foresight to do that and to awaken yourself to all these different topics and to see, the fact that, hey, history is not necessarily what we've been told, and what is our history and what has been removed from our history. And I'm just kind of curious too, along those lines of when you're researching, the esoteric history versus the written account history, how do you determine in your mind what is the reality? And when I say reality, like the true history versus, oh, this makes sense, that makes sense, so I don't know, I'll just pick one. So yeah, how do you determine in your viewpoint the true history?
I think that the more I learn, the more I see how little both I and West humanity know about, especially our past that passed away and it's not anymore with us. And I try to be logical, I try to be a little bit mystical also with these topics, and I still don't claim that I know the ultimate truth. I am not claiming that I know the entire truth about lost history, lost civilizations, and the people who don't believe my version are stupid or something. No. What I'm doing with my book, with podcast appearances like today's one, I'm showing people the possibilities. I'm showing people how little we know about our history, how many possibilities there are for existence of previous civilizations, lost civilizations, Atlantis, megaliths, pyramids, what secrets they are hiding, and how we do not know much and everything about these kind of structures or ancient texts. So and what I'm also doing, I'm trying to look at a big picture. So I'm not, as plenty of people, and especially in modern times when it comes to the academia, scientists are having very, very strict specializations. So when it comes to history right now, I'm also studying history at my local university here in Gdańsk, and I see there are specializations. And it's not like, okay, you're a specialist in the Middle Ages, you're in the ancient times. No, you're, let's say, a specialist in 20 years of this ancient civilization. So let's say you're a specialist in the Roman Republic in this century only. And what I'm doing and what I want to do, and I think how I think going beyond mainstream and trying to see this true picture of our past, is looking at the big picture, connecting as many dots as possible from as many scientific disciplines, areas of knowledge, and all the information we have. And I see, okay, this connects to that, this connects with that. And when we see the bigger picture, I think we can see that, okay, if this works in this region, in this region, and in this region, and in this time period, in this time period, and in this time period, then maybe there is something more to it. It's basically similar to other sciences, not history, but other sciences. When you see that the data is replicable, you start formulating hypotheses. Okay, when I see that in all of these regions there are mentions of lost civilizations and that there are similarities when it comes to the names, when it comes to the locations, when it comes to the stories of these lost civilizations themselves, I can formulate hypotheses that there may have been a previous civilization. So to some extent, I have like scientific mind, but applicable in a totally different way because modern historians are not working like that.
No, and that's amazing. And looking at the different civilizations, there are similarities, like you're saying, and one that I think is most interesting, and you you try to theorize how it's possible, but the only way that it's possible and would be is like if we were one landmass. And what I'm talking about is the fact in Bosnia we have pyramids, in Africa and Egypt we have pyramids, in Central America, Mexico, we have pyramids, South America, we have pyramids, North America, we have pyramids, and some have been destroyed for farmland, sadly. But all in all, it's basically all over the world are pyramids. But how would each civilization, without knowledge of another civilization, build the same type structure? And when I say type, I mean like the pyramid shape as we know it. Yes, there's step, or there's, different types of pyramids, but in essence, it's still the same space, the same generic look. And so, what in your opinion explains the fact of this global building of these structures, and what do you think they were built for and by whom, if you have ideas?
Yes, I agree. If you're thinking about that there's connection between the pyramids, even with the Plato story of Atlantis, Plato is telling us that Atlantis was a global maritime civilization, not just a singular city. So we can connect it a little bit with Atlantis, and there are extremely very similar connections when it comes to pyramids from plenty of different regions of the entire world. But also, we need to be a little bit rational, logical with that, because the pyramids can arise independently of each other, because most of them, as you've said, are not like straight pyramids. Some are like stepped pyramids, some are just mounds that we often call the pyramids. And I think that if, let's say, we are very primitive human beings, like ancient people, like hunter gatherers, or we just started civilization, I think that the pyramid shape, the mound shape, is the easiest way to build up. Because let's say you want to build something high and you're primitive. Would you build something like a tower? It would be very difficult to build a tower. It could very easily collapse. So what you're doing, the easiest way if you want to go up and build up, is to build a pyramid, a mound, a step pyramid. So I think it's very logical and rational to say that, okay, that's why there are pyramids everywhere on Earth. But that's for, and it's applicable for many of them, but for the other many of them, there are similarities between them that are beyond this explanation that it's just an attempt of primitive humans to build up, and that's the easiest way to build up. Because, for instance, the three famous pyramids of Giza have similarities with the Mexican, so on the other side of the world, pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico. And you see that, okay, here we've got three main pyramids in Giza, there we have three main pyramids in Mexico with Teotihuacan. You see that all of them are lined up from the biggest to the smallest. Okay, but still, maybe it's just a coincidence. But then you go into the alignment of them. They are both in Egypt and in Mexico aligned to the Orion belt. And you think, that may be something more than just coincidence. But then you go even deeper and you see the dimensions. The dimension of the biggest, the Great Pyramid of Giza, when it comes to its base, is almost the same as the pyramid, the biggest one, the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan. What is also interesting is that the Mexican pyramid, the biggest one of the Sun, is also almost exactly like within 96, 97% half of the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So I think if we want to think even logically, even scientifically, even skeptically, in with this example, we see that it's much more than just a coincidence because we have so many things. Let's list the similarities. Okay, one, it's a pyramid. The second, there are three of them. The third would be they're all lined up from the biggest to the smallest. The fourth would be the Orion belt alignment. The fifth would be the size of the base of the biggest in each, in Giza and in Mexico. And the sixth would be the biggest one is half of the height of the Egyptian one, the biggest one in Mexico. So I think that's how we should think about that okay, some pyramids are very primitive, some pyramids may arise independently of each other, but it doesn't mean that it applies to all of them. So that's, I think, the middle ground between thinking okay, all of the pyramids are from a global civilization, which is truly not the case because some of them can be dated and we see that some of them are from completely different ages and from different people, but at the same time it doesn't deny that there are connections between them.
Right, and there's also the fact of like what we call the step pyramids. I believe is like Sumeria has them, but we also are starting to find underwater off of the coast of Japan is step pyramids, and so it's like, wait a minute, if these are underwater, does that mean Japan was larger, or did they like slide off in like an earthquake, or how did it end up in the water? Or and there's something that we don't consider: was it built in the water on purpose? And
Mhm.
so I'm just kind of curious, as you're researching, the locations like desert versus forest versus the water. Do you think there's a reason they're in that environment versus like we clear the land and build up? Why would ancient times they leave them in the natural environment?
It basically points us to prehistorical times before the end of the last ice age. So, before the last ice age ended, and as the name suggests, it was an ice age, so there were plenty of ice caps. Then, when it was ending, the ice caps were melting, and even casual mainstream geologists are approximating that the change of the sea levels from the end of the last ice age, so from approximately 12,000 years ago up until the ancient times, even not nowadays, was approximately 120 meters, just like 400 feet. So imagine 400 feet of sea level change. Imagine standing on a beach and you see like a skyscraper, tall of water. This was the sea level change, and all over the world since that time there sank because the glaciers melted, so the sea level rose and tons of land masses completely sank, and it's approximated that there sank about 25 million square kilometers, which is the same as the entire North America, with Canada, with Mexico, with all the surrounding islands, all over the world, since the end of the last ice age. And we come back to Plato's Atlantis because Plato is dating the lost civilization of Atlantis approximately 9,000 years before Solon. So he actually points to the destruction, or because it's not like clearly stated, he points that Atlantis was at the end or before the end of the last ice age. So it's logical that it could have sunk due to this sea level changes, but it also connected to what you were talking about, different structures. It's not only the famous Yonaguni near Japan, but also near Azores, near Cadiz, Spain, near Cuba. There are plenty of anomalous underwater objects that may have been created by human beings, and these objects could be from before the end of the last ice age, so from before the sea levels changed and the water rose up 400 feet, 120 meters. And it would connect these structures to this idea of a lost civilization, whether it was Atlantis or any other kind of previous lost civilization. And it's interesting because we, for instance, find plenty of anomalous maps that are from, for instance, medieval times, the Renaissance times, and they are showing us, maybe not like there are these famous ones of Antarctica, but there are plenty of other maps that are showing us clearly structures like geographical landmasses, like the Beringia Bridge connecting Alaska with Russia, or plenty of islands from before the Ice Age. And I believe that's how it's connected with what I talked about. Atlantis by Plato was a maritime global civilization, that it was much more than just a single city, and maybe some of the pyramids and some of these underwater ruins are clearly connected to a civilization that existed before the end of the last ice age.
Yeah, I kind of agree. And as we're talking about, the ancient maps, when we look at the maps of when they say like Pangea was around, where we were one giant landmass that broke into the world that we know today, I find it kind of interesting because we can put all the pieces together and make one giant landmass. But to me, what I kind of find interesting is that's today's map, yes. But when we're talking about like Atlantis and Lemuria, which were large land masses that disappeared, how do we truly know what Pangea looked like, because we're not accounting for large continent sized land masses? Because like I've heard, like Atlantis referred to as the lost continent, not the lost island, which to me says, it was much bigger than what we realize. And if so, where and how would it fit in a map and of the ancient times? Have you ever thought about that and looked at maps and been like, oh, this is where it would fit?
Yes, of course, Pangea is this idea of millions or even hundreds of millions of years ago. Even I don't remember the exact date, probably 1 billion or something. So there could have been plenty of changes. And also, if you truly like use modern map and try to fit the continents together, they fit. But still, it's not like 100% truly fit that goes of this of America's fit with the with Africa or Europe. They fit very similarly, but still it allows there to be some kind of island stuff. But Atlantis was never meant to be a true continent, even in, let's say, channeling visions of it. But by Edgar Cayce and others, they say it was a significantly sized island, but never a continent. For Plato, it was of the size of Libya and Asia Minor, which would also let it be like maybe half of modern Turkey or something like that. So I don't think it was a huge, huge continent. On the other side of the spectrum, when it comes to Lemuria, Muso, on the other side of the world, on the Pacific Ocean, when you talked about Pangea, it's connecting Americas through the Atlantic to Europe and then to Africa. But then on the other side of the world, and right now the Pacific Ocean is the biggest body of water. There was this big body of water, so still there is huge possibility that there was some kind of continent, because Lemuria on the Pacific Ocean was more of a continent than Atlantis was. So for Lemuria, it can clearly be that there was something that we do not take into account when we connect everything into Pangea. But when it comes to Atlantis, I still think that for such an island, there could be place when it comes to this theory.
And looking at Atlantis as an island, and piecing together the stories, and Plato, where you hear like Plato refers to Atlanteans traveling into Egypt, and survivors were in Egypt, and you don't really hear of survivors going to Mexico or South America. And so it kind of, I
You
think that's why
hear, you
people
hear.
paint it in the Mediterranean. But in you doing your research, where do you kind of feel like Atlantis, the island, would have been if you could theorize and picture based on your research?
Yes, I will start with this idea that there is nothing about survivors coming to Mexico, let's say, or South America. In my book, I provide some example of Native Americans, of Aztecs, Mayans. There are even mentions in Mexico that there were two influxes of people, one from the east, one from the west. And researchers interpret that as okay, some people came from the Pacific Ocean, so from Lemuria, as it was called, and some from Atlantis, from the west. And I think that the final nail in the coffin to show that there truly was a final nail in the coffin on the theory that there was no connection with Atlantis and Mexico or any kind of American stuff is the fact that the late capital city of the Aztec, Tenochtitlan, pyramids were Teotihuacan, and this was Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was based on Atlantis because the Aztecs told the conquistadors that they based Tenochtitlan on their previous land of Aztlan. Aztlan, Atlantis, very similar name. And in other myths, Aztlan does not look like Atlantis, so skeptics say there is no connection, it's just a coincidence of the names Aztlan and Atlantis. But then you go into details. If Tenochtitlan was truly based on this lost land of Aztlan, then it looks very similar to Atlantis because just as Atlantis was this island and there was in the middle of it there was a hill, and on this hill there was a temple of Poseidon, and then around the main, the main part of the island there were concentric rings of water, land connected by bridges. Tenochtitlan looked very similar because it was located on Lake Texcoco in Mexico, very huge lake, and it was partially connected with each other, artificial and natural islands connected by bridges. And in the middle, there was a temple called Templo Mayor, which was basically a pyramid. But you probably also know very well how Mexican pyramids look like. Very often, lots of them are just artificial mounds, artificial hills that even do not look like a pyramid, and then on top there's a chapel, a temple, whatever it is. So this was how it looks like. And I think that, okay, Plato describes Atlantis, that in the middle there was this hill, and on this hill there was this temple of Poseidon. So I think the Templo Mayor was this representation of this hill with the temple of Poseidon. And then you see that, okay, Plato is telling us that there were these concentric rings of land and water connected by bridges. So they tried in Tenochtitlan to do very similar stuff, but maybe not circular as in Plato's story, but again, plenty of artificial and natural islands connected with each other. And if they said that they modeled this city, because it was not Atlantis, they modeled it after their legendary lost land, the cradle of human civilization, Aztlan, that clearly shows us that Aztlan of the Aztecs was Atlantis or was something very similar. So maybe Plato is not telling us that there were influxes, but Plato is telling us that there was some kind of continent on the other side of Atlantis. So he says, because right now let's go into locations, that was like the digression to what you've told about similarities and connections to North, South, and Central America. But when it comes to location, Plato is clearly telling us that Atlantis was outside of the Mediterranean Sea. So all the skeptics and plenty of scientists say, okay, Atlantis was based on reality, but it was some kind of island on the Mediterranean Sea. And it is completely wrong when we compare it to Plato's story, because Plato is clearly distinguishing the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. He calls the Atlantic Ocean Okeanos, and he says that when you go out of the Mediterranean Sea, there there are these pillars of Hercules, and then in front of them, whatever it means, there is this civilization of Atlantis, lost island of Atlantis. And then there is this huge okeanos, which is clearly a different Greek word to Mediterranean. Mediterranean Sea was called completely differently. So then there is this huge body of water, okeanos, and then there is a continent, he says, that surrounds this okeanos. And when you take a look, if you were to sail out of the Mediterranean Sea through the Straits of Gibraltar, so Straits of Hercules, and so you basically turn by 90 degrees the world map, you see that both Americas are surrounding, only the Arctic and Antarctic regions are open, but Americas are surrounding these okeanos body of water, so what we call nowadays the Atlantic Ocean. And that's why I think that Atlantis was somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean, maybe as some people say near Azores, others say near Cadiz, Spain, somewhere there. I also think that way, but it doesn't mean for instance, that the famous Richat structure, which is very similar to Plato's Atlantis when it comes to its looks, it doesn't mean that it also wasn't Atlantis, because if Atlantis, as even you mentioned, it went to Egypt, Plato is telling us that Egypt was Atlantean colony and that Atlanteans had their influences over the entire Mediterranean Sea. And I think that Atlantis was much more than this singular city that Plato described. I think that there may have been a few of these cities. Maybe Richat structure was one of these, and the other were in Azores. The other, even third one, could be in Cuba or somewhere else. So I think that this idea doesn't exclude possibility that Richat was also Atlantis. So that's my take on it. I think that just as Plato is telling us, Atlantis was somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean, but then other possible locations can also be Atlantis.
And that brings to mind like the story of like Montezuma and why he allowed the Spaniards in, because he viewed them as their god because of the white skin, and everybody, you know, tries to think, who would be the white skin, it must have been a European. And I look at, like you're saying, if Atlantis was in the middle, would the fact that they're in the Atlantic Ocean, not quite in the Mediterranean, explain the tone of the skin and why? Okay, that's why Montezuma allowed this to happen versus saying, wait a minute, you're not our god, you don't look anything like our god. And that's where the confusion came in, because when we look at like the Europeans that were traveling, I wouldn't necessarily really say like, oh, they all had white skin, because a lot of them had a brownish tint to them or a tannish tint to them, but it specifically says white. And so that's where I kind of always felt like, who were the first whites that they came in contact with?
Yes, that's a very good thread of thinking and connecting all of that. There are a few even scientists and plenty of researchers who connect that, and I think it's shown genetically, not even when it comes to the skin color, but genetically, that on the coasts of mostly North America and Atlantic coast of South America, Central America, and on the other side, on the coast of Africa and on places like Azores, the Canary Islands, etc., there seems to be the same genetic line of people. Some people also connect that with bloodlines. So it seems that, all around the Atlantic Ocean, there is similarities between people. So it may be that when Atlantis, somewhere on the Atlantic, sank, they, went everywhere on all the sides, to both locations. And also when it comes to that, And it's a very dangerous topic, and some people even call it racist because it basically led to all the Nazis' theories about Aryan race. So Nazis believe that there is this legendary Aryan race, and they said it was Germanic. But initially, before the Nazis, it was these people were called Atlanteans, and or giants even to some people, researchers in the 1800s and early 1900s, because there is some evidence that ancient people from the Canary Islands, from the Azores, and on the other side, on the coasts, especially as I've said, of Americas, were tall, blonde or red-haired giants with blue eyes. Giants, I mean very high, very tall people. Maybe not giants like 3 meters, 2 something, but much taller than the rest when it comes to their genetics. So, and that led later to all of the, of course, racist theories. So this is a very dangerous topic, but I think there is something to it. And just because Nazis used it in their own negative way doesn't mean that we shouldn't research it more and that we should do investigation into that, because maybe these were the Atlanteans we are searching. And that's why we see, for instance, Graham Hancock with his Ancient Apocalypse, and skeptics say, oh, Graham Hancock is racist. And it was this debate and this arguing on the internet that how can Graham Hancock be racist even his wife Santa is of a darker skin color? And Graham Hancock, I think, never said anything racist, but there is this misrepresentation that his theories and Atlantis theories overall are all racist because they also connect to the Nazis' ideas of the Aryan race and of these, either blonde or red-haired giants with blue eyes.
Right, and I agree, and I think people just will do what they're gonna do, and it's unfortunate that we're in a world where we all can't share ideas. That we have to conform our ideas to a certain extent, or we get banned or mocked and ridiculed, and so and in that aspect, I kind of wonder is the fact that that exists in this world and that it can take root, and the majority of people who in my opinion are free thinkers give away their power to the people that are the limited thinkers. Do you think that that is part of, you mentioned like the matrix simulation theory, that that's why this is happening in our world, and as we're waking up and realizing that this world is not truly everything that we think it is that why they're all of a suddenly freaking out and the world is starting to react the way it is?
When it comes to this idea of matrix, of reality or simulation hypothesis, I'm more into the stuff not like on the political level or what is happening in the entire world, but more when it comes to the fabric of reality, like what is reality made of and how it's illusionary. So I will come back to this in a moment. But when it comes to this idea that of big thinkers and small thinkers, this is what I've mentioned about specializations in plenty of scientific disciplines like history. Plenty of people are just, not thinking about the big picture. And I was always a big thinker. Some people say even too big. And, during my school years, lots of teachers and lots of people wanted to, that I should come back to Earth and not think about such big ideas. But I think that there is a problem in modern society. And it's a personal, I think, problem of many people that they are too little thinkers. Like, okay, only this, like they're focused on things that are sometimes unnecessary, that are sometimes of very low practicality, that are sometimes, not making the shift. And there are these big ideas, like even, when you see big thinkers like Tesla, Isaac Newton, and stuff like that, their ideas were the, moving the needle, moving everything forward. And people nowadays are, so stuck in the known world. And what is interesting is that it's mythological. And what I mean mythological is that the basic psychology behind myths and legends about fairies, about, a beast or a monster that is threatening the kingdom are all warnings about what is happening right now when it comes to little thinkers. Because when it comes to the basic story, psychologists found that most of these stories are all about hero that undergoes an evolution or goes on a journey, and throughout this journey he goes beyond what is known to people, what is known to humanity, and with this knowledge of the unknown he comes back and he slays the dragon, kills a monster, because initially there is, let's say, a kingdom, and this kingdom is the metaphor for the known world, and hero is going outside of the known world for his own adventure, for his own journey, and he comes back with knowledge that's beyond what the kingdom had. And the kingdom, with its current caged knowledge, limited knowledge, was not able to kill the monster, to kill the dragon, or to, make things happen. But then the hero with the outside knowledge is coming back, he slays the monster, and then he becomes king or something. So that's what basically is when it comes to the evolution of knowledge. Even, scientists claim that it's how there are paradigm shifts in science. That, let's say, the current paradigm is the known world, and all the science is only about what is known, and we are specializing in small fields, and we are still within the bubble of the known. And what we are doing as, let's say, alternative researchers or people interested in paranormal stuff that are outside of even the domain of science, we are going outside of this bubble into the unknown, and we do not know. We do not know what Bigfoot is. We do not know what this paranormal stuff is. We initially don't know what Atlantis was, but we are, going outside of the known, and then we can come back and say, and we are doing that. We are coming back and saying to science, you are skeptics. You say that there is nothing paranormal, nothing spiritual, but how you explain this phenomena? How you explain that phenomena? How you explain, this kind of stuff? And this is how science is, evolving, but it's a very, very slow process, because how science basically evolved in very, very past was that there was this paradigm of like, okay, we assume this was true about our history, this was true about physics, but then you see one anomaly that, for instance, Newtonian mechanics were not applied to like very small quantum level, or it wasn't applied to a big level of the Einstein's gravity stuff. So you see there are more and more anomalies incoming, and current paradigm cannot explain anything about that. So then you go beyond that, and then you come back with new knowledge, and when there is too many anomalies, science can say, okay, they do not exist, because they can say that lost civilizations do not exist if they have only little examples of that. But then the more examples are coming, the paradigm shift is incoming. So I think that this is metaphorical, this is mythological, this is legendary, psychological on all level of the current society, that lots of these skeptics, lots of these people that are putting other down because there are conspiracy theories, because they are believing in some spiritual paranormal stuff down, they are doing that because they are still functioning from only this limited cage of the known, of the science, etc. But if, for instance, I go here on our show and I show you this anomaly, that anomaly, and there are too many of them to ignore, you need to take them into your assumptions, into your theories about the world, about history, and then there is this paradigm shift because you update your theories and you see, okay, our previous assumptions were wrong, and we need to take into consideration possibility that there was Atlantis, that there was a previous civilization, that there were connections between the ancient world and ancient cultures from Mexico to Egypt, etc. And maybe Plato was, to at least some extent, right and not wrong with his Atlantis story. So that's this whole idea about current state. But as I've said, the matrix reality stuff is a little bit different, and we can go into it further.
No, I appreciate the clarification and, and the insight. And one thing that I'm kind of curious with, if you've tied or have any theories behind, is when we look at megalithic structures that are all around the world. Like, for example, there's Adam's calendar in Africa, there's Stonehenge in America and in the UK. Do you feel like those were created by a lost civilization and that there's a connection between all of those? And I'm going to also include in there the Moai statues where we're starting to figure out they're full bodied. We always thought were just heads because finally somebody decided to dig a hole and discover, hey, there's more to this than meets the eye. So, do you think there's a connection to lost civilizations there that we just don't consider because we just say, oh, these people made it?
Yes, there's a huge connection when it comes to the megas from all over the world, from Easter Island, through South America, through Europe, Egypt, and then as far Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and stuff like that. But I don't think that all the megaliths are connected in that way. I provide in my book specific examples, what I called prehistoric cyclopean architecture of these polygonal walls. I think the best example of which is this megalithic mosaic in Sacsayhuaman, Peru, or everywhere in Cusco. So we are basically talking about huge rocks that are connected to each other, very tightly fit. You cannot, into many of them, fit like a sheet of paper or a knife in between them, and they have no mortar at all. So they are polygonal, not like just basic squares or circles. They are polygonal, very tightly polished and fit together, and they are huge. And we see similar megalithic polygonal walls on Easter Island. It's not only the Moai statues, but there on Easter Island we see this exact same megalithic walls as in Peru, the entire Andes region in South America. But then you go to Europe, Greece, Italy, very similar structures. And even here in Greece, these structures are considered the oldest. Before the Greek civilization even appeared, these walls were already built. And historians say, oh, they were built in order to, not let invaders come into these civilizations that were just starting here in Greece. But actually, the Greeks had a different version of this story. They said that's where the Cyclopean Walls name comes from, because they basically said it were Cyclops before humans who built these megalithic walls. So even the ancients did not claim that they built the walls, but these were Cyclops who built them. And then you see, for instance, Egypt. And Egypt, when you see Egypt, it looks at first to be a completely different civilization than, let's say, the Peruvian one or the European stuff, and they are built from a completely different material. But at some of, I believe, the oldest sections of both, let's say, the pyramids, and it's especially being seen on the third one, the Menkaure pyramid, or in places, because the Giza plateau is not only the three main pyramids, but also plenty of different structures, like shafts, like temples, and one of the temple near the pyramids is underground, under the level of the pyramids. It's called Osirion, and it's built entirely of these huge megalithic blocks, similar, almost exactly the same to the Peruvian Sacsayhuaman Cusco walls. And what is interesting is that other architecture in ancient Egypt was built it was built completely different. It was a completely different architectural style, and none of such blocks were used in other buildings in ancient Egypt, and there were huge buildings built there. So I believe these are much older structures, probably pre-Diluvian, so pre last ice age times, pre this time where there was this sea level change, probably from the times of, let's say, approximately Atlantis. And then you see, for instance, Far East, the same kind of megalithic architecture, polygonal walls, and you can think why they did that, why they shaped these blocks and they look like melted together. There are myths, let's say legends in the Peruvian region of there was an ancient plant and they used this plant to melt these stones, these blocks together, but I think these kinds of structures were from the previous civilization, pre-Diluvian, Atlantis, whatever. And I always tell people, even when you ask researchers or people who were to all these places, if you take a picture from the Egyptian, from these blocks, which are of course a little bit different in color, a little bit more beige, a little bit more yellow than the Peruvian, which are just gray. If you take pictures in Egypt, in Peru, and let's say on Easter Island, and take the colors out of the picture, I think that lots of researchers, scientists wouldn't be able to distinguish whether these are the Egyptian one, the Peruvian one, or the Easter Island one. So that's what I think about the connection with the megaliths and Atlantis. And I don't think we see such a connection with Stonehenge, with other megaliths from different sides. There are other similarities for sure, like you've mentioned Stonehenge. I think it's under the lake in America, and then you see Stonehenge in Great Britain. But I think that these megalithic walls are the biggest like smoking gun when it comes to lost civilization evidence and what they left behind up until modern times.
And that's, and I never thought about, the stones being the same. And I'm kind of curious, as we're, theorizing, how these are built and everything. These stones that are like solid pieces, whether they're obelisks or the stones of like the pyramids or Stonehenge or Adam's calendar, wherever they are.
Adam's calendar is different than what I talked about, and I believe that it may be even, and it is, I think, probably it was dated even by scientists that it's much older than that. So it's a different story, I think.
Okay, well, I'm where I'm going with the idea though is if in ancient times we were able to move these stones around because like Stonehenge, there is no quarry nearby that we know of that they could have used for these stones. So, how were we able to, in ancient times, transport these stones, lift them up, set them into place? Where when we try it today, it's like in the time frame that they say it was built, our normal scientists and engineers say we can't replicate today.
I wouldn't agree so. I researched the stones very, very extensively, and there were plenty of attempts to showing that, let's say, the Stonehenge are only a few tons of weight. There are others that are hundreds of tons of weight. These hundreds of tons of weight may be very problematic to move, but the just Stonehenge ones we are able as humans, even with primitive technology, able to move them. It would take a long time, and it's a mystery. Why would they do that? And if they use, because just because we can use primitive technology to do something doesn't mean that it was that way. Because right now I can, let's say, go laser cut a stone, and let's say I will cut it in a way that is also possible with primitive tools. But does it mean that I used the primitive tools? No, I used the advanced tools. So it doesn't mean that they use that, but it's a wrong assumption that we cannot move these, let's say the Stonehenge ones. I would say we can move stones up to 10-20 tons. But there are bigger problems with stones because, for instance, the Great Pyramid of Giza, there are estimates, even the conservative ones, 1.2 million blocks. And when you divide it by the time they allegedly built the pyramid, let's say in 20 years, you see that each stone would be needed to be cut, transported to the site, and then ideally placed on the Great Pyramid in like 5-9 minutes, depending on how many blocks we estimate. I have the calculations in my book, and I think that's the bigger problem. Or the bigger problem could be these megalithic walls, how they did that. They are so tightly fit together, and why they did that. So, but I think with just transporting the Stonehenge block, it's not that big of a deal. It's very, of course, exhausting. It's very, if they truly did that as what we call primitive people with no advanced tools, it's truly fascinating and remarkable achievement, but still possible.
Yes, and there is a question in the chat room around, as we're talking about like moving like the pyramid to be built in that time frame. Could it be ETs or giants were around and we just erased them from history and claimed it to be, oh, we humans did it, and it we didn't think about, oh, wait a minute, we can't fit this in the timetable. Well, nobody's going to calculate that. They're just going to believe it's us, and that's where the story comes from. And is that a possibility, you think? Or is that people speculating and trying to make an argument to make the scenario real? And both sides are going to always be in conflict because both sides are kind of tweaking the story to make it fit and not looking at the real picture.
There are a few channelings, so channeling messages by some ET source or whatever that claim that the pyramids, especially the Giza ones, were built by extraterrestrials. When it comes to the, let's say, earthly sources, there are no mentions when it comes to the whether megaliths or pyramids and extraterrestrials. There are also no mentions, I think, at least when it comes to Egypt and probably Peru, of giants building them. But when it comes to giants, I always tell people that there is even huge within scientific paradigm, huge possibility for giants to exist because right now we are the only hominid species on Earth. Like we are different than monkeys, than apes, than chimpanzees, than gorillas. But in the past, and during the times of anatomically modern humans, so during our existence as our species, we coexisted with plenty of other hominids. Like the Neanderthals, for instance, they weren't our direct ancestors, but they coexisted with us. But at one point, we coexisted with at least, for now, 5 other hominid species. And amongst these species were Neanderthals, were Homo denisovans, but were also hobbits, Homo floresiensis, 1 meter tall, so like half, 2/3 of a human being, like some even smaller than that. And they were hominid species. They built things, so they were more advanced than monkeys. They used tools. They were hominids like Neanderthals, but they were very small, and they were discovered in early 2000s mostly. So I think that there is a huge possibility that if we coexisted with 5 other hominid species and we are still discovering other species of hominids and we are still nowhere to have a full list of them, and even when it comes to some of the hominids we only have a few examples. So imagine if we have a few examples of this hominid race, maybe some other race completely vanished and their, let's say, remnants completely got destroyed throughout hundreds, tens of thousands of years, or maybe millions of years. So I think that if we coexist with other hominids and there were small people hobbits, there probably were also giants, or what we would call giants. So I think there is a huge possibility for giants to exist out there in the past, maybe even recent past, because Neanderthals were up to about 20,000 years ago, so not that long ago. And I think that giants could have been there. I don't know if they built pyramids or megaliths. I don't think I can right now think of any source that, like ancient texts, or mentions giants, that giants built megaliths or pyramids, but maybe there are some.
And and one thing that I look at too, as we're talking about like the evolutionary scale, is there's always that scientific little nuance of, we're like, yes, we were here, here, here. Wait a minute, we're missing this, and now we're here, here, here we are. And so there's that little thing known as the missing link. And I've kind of find it a little bit interesting when, we look at, science and trying to figure out our place in the world and everything. a lot of people seem to like just skip over the missing link and go, oh, this is, this is this and this is the flow. And we're like, wait, what about that missing link? Oh, it's missing. Don't worry about it. It's like, wait a minute. So, and we have in ancient stories like the giants or Nephilim. Could that be the missing link? And tie in, but because in our modern nomenclature we're like giants are a myth and the Nephilim is just a story, they never really existed. Is that why they will continue to say the missing link is missing and we can't establish who it is because they're trying to keep that link out of history?
Maybe yes, maybe it was so problematic to us because when it comes to the Nephilim and other mentions of giants, these giants are not always benevolent to human beings, so maybe it's like trauma stuff that we wanted to, let's say we killed them, that even Greek myths of Cyclops, let's say, we killed these Cyclops, these giants, whatever there were, these beings, and then we wanted to completely erase this memory. There is, I think, that possibility. When it comes to the missing link, I think there were not like direct missing link, let's say, between us and previous hominids. I think that they were just parallel to us. They were for sure a missing part of our history and probably a very important part, but I think they were more like, let's say, a branch. So this is like previous hominid, and these are us, these are giants, these are hobbits. So we are parallel, but we are not like directly that giants are here and we are the offspring of giants. Maybe to some extent, just as we could procreate with Neanderthals, and we have some Neanderthal DNA. So I think there could have been, like in these stories, that giants took earthly women for them, etc. It could have been possible in some cases. There are even cool legends. These are legends, but maybe there is some truth behind them, that when Mongols in the medieval times, about 700, 800 years ago, were coming from Mongolia, so far east, up to Europe, here in Poland, we were fighting the Mongols in the medieval times. When they were traveling through Central Asia, they probably, or at least according to legends, found such hominids. So still a few hundred years ago, there probably were these hominids, because they mentioned that they were not apes at all. They were like human beings. They were very hairy. They were more primitive, but there were cases of humans having children with these beings, which means that these couldn't have been monkeys or apes or chimpanzees, but they needed to be some hominids closely related with us, Homo sapiens sapiens, depending how we call ourselves, because there is still a debate on that. And I think these are very interesting stories, because also the Epic of Gilgamesh and Kidu in there is also like a hominid being. He can live amongst human beings. He's much stronger, much more hairy, maybe a little bit less intelligent, but still not a monkey. He's like at least intelligent to use tools, to be amongst humans, and to live. And there isn't a mention of procreation, but in the legends of the Mongols, there were. So I think these are like missing part of the history, but I don't think there are like a truly missing link, like when it comes to our species, how we evolved. And there is, I think, another missing link about what was happening when our modern species, so anatomically modern humans, appeared, because according to one of the main genetic theories, we basically appeared out of a total random genetic change called the diffusion of chromosomes. So we have 23 pairs of them, but it seems that our ancestor had one pair more than us. And what is interesting, that in most cases when we have different chromosome pairs, like in modern humans, if we have a pair less or pair more of chromosomes, it's very problematic. The Down syndrome is caused by having not ideal number of chromosomes. But in these ancient human, prehistoric human, or pre-human species, it led to us anatomically modern humans that were much better than other hominids, much more advanced, and geneticists traced this DNA that due to this fusion, completely random event, and it's like when it comes to probability of it happening, it's like 0.000001, plenty of zeros. It's not impossible, but very improbable to happen. And such fusion should have led to some negative changes in this prehistoric human, but it actually led, and geneticists were able to trace it. It led to higher cognitive abilities, to grow in prefrontal cortex, also to being able to experience higher emotions like compassion or love that is not like selfish love. And this is a fact, but we can interpret this completely random genetic change in plenty of ways, completely improbable. Maybe it was God, maybe it were aliens manipulating our DNA, or maybe it was just, a coincidence in nature. So I think that this is the bigger missing link than just giants.
Well, and I'm wondering in your, looking into the ancient texts and, discovering like encoded knowledge and different consciousness and, beliefs in the writings. It seems like there's periods where we seem to be lost in history, so to speak, of we're just conquering land, building civilization, then somebody conquers us, they build civilization, and it just repeats. Nothing really big happens. Then all of a sudden, there's a leap in technology, and we're like, oh, now this civilization having this ability grows, and now we're becoming more global, and we're not small little tribes anymore. And then a little bit later, there's another little jump in, our evolution, and we start going to sea versus staying on land. And my curiosity is in your studies of these ancient texts and encoded knowledge, how do they account for all of a suddenly one day being land based isolation mentality to, okay, now we're going to go spread out and we're going to go sail the oceans blue, so to speak, and making these evolutionary jumps and growths and, spurts in mankind?
This view is actually a popular myth, and even among mainstream historians, archaeologists, it's completely different. Actually, before any kind of civilization, according to them, there were, migrations all over the place in deep prehistory, like 20, 60, 40,000 years ago. And then the first, let's say, sedentary lifestyle happened approximately, let's say, 10,000, 12,000 years ago. So this view that, first they did that and then they decided to travel the world and, go across the seas, this is a completely wrong view. It wasn't like that. When it comes to the evolution, let's say, and all of a sudden starting civilization and stuff like that, there are plenty of myths from all over the world that there were some kind of teachers of mankind, gods, demigods traveling and building civilization. Sometimes anew after some kind of cataclysm. Sometimes there is no cataclysm mentioned, but they are building like that. But when it comes to the Neolithic Revolution and the switch from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to the sedentary one, and then for cities, then for civilization, I think the biggest thing about it is that even nowadays it says that we as anatomically modern humans existed for about 200, 300, or even half a million years. There are different measures about that. And then all recorded history, so first civilization is only 6,000 years ago. So it's like 1 to 3% of all our existence. Then Neolithic Revolution, so the first, according to science, switch from nomadic to sedentary lifestyle is 12,000 years ago. It's very interesting that it's the same date almost as the ending of the last ice age. And once it was natural because, you know, just the climate was better, but also it may be that it was a reboot of civilization after Atlantis, after this lost civilization, who knows. But still, at 12,000 years and 300,000, it's a huge difference. And it wasn't that this switch was all of a sudden, like let's say from one day to the other or from one year to the other. It took a while. But still, if we take a look, hundreds of thousands of years of our species and then 12,000 years ago, sedentary lifestyle, I think there is something wrong with that. Why there couldn't be a civilization 50,000 years ago, 60, 100,000 years ago? I think it's very, very possible. And actually, in my book, I start my book because it's Deja Vu has everything already been. I didn't want it to be just a boring book about Atlantis, connections, etc. I started the first chapter from something completely different. I started it from this idea: what would happen nowadays if there was a cataclysm? How our civilization would behave? How survivors would behave? What would be left from us, let's say, if there was a cataclysm right now? How many years it would take for a civilization to be completely decomposed, degraded, eroded away? And I think on all of that, based on all of that research, and I also researched like material science, technical stuff, I think in 20, maybe 50,000 years, there wouldn't be much left from our modern civilization, maybe 5% of everything left. That's why I think there is a huge possibility that maybe 100,000 years ago, 50, 100,000, 200,000 years ago, there was some kind of civilization, but basically it haven't left us plenty of evidence, and maybe we haven't dug, we haven't dug the entire planet, the entire Earth, so maybe there is still something hiding when it comes to these previous civilizations. And then, after this chapter about nowadays, about what would happen if there was a cataclysm, I go into this historical stuff about lost civilization to show that even lots of myths and legends about these teachers of mankind, about the reboots of civilization, they are very similar to modern scenarios. They are very similar to what would happen if nowadays we were destroyed and maybe some people will survive, and maybe after a few hundred years, few thousand years, they would start civilization again. So I think, that's the overall picture of that. And that, I think, is the big mystery about how it was all of a sudden this, all of a sudden that.
No, and I agree. And, there's so many things in modern science where I kind of feel like the story is a story and the reality is something different, but they're like, hey, we've made our livelihood at this story and we don't want to change it because we don't want to admit we were wrong. And therefore, they're like closed off to any notion that challenges their idea. That's just a theory that I have of why certain information goes forward and some information gets swept under the rug, like, Tesla with free energy. Why we don't have free energy devices? Well, because the people who are making money off of selling you the energy don't want to lose their profits. So let's bury the free option. And so that's where I wonder, throughout history, how much of our knowledge has been taken from us because of that mentality.
Yes, for sure it was taken. I think that because when it comes to history, and that's that was my biggest shift, and that's why I started researching all of that. We see it as a as this pristine model. Okay, there were ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, and then medieval times, and then modern times, etc., etc. And it looks like, okay, we know so much. But basically, even if you think about nowadays, how much of the evidence from this day to day will last, let's say, next 20, 30 years? This conversation is recorded online. Maybe there still will be internet and it will be archived somewhere, but there is also a huge chance that in 50 years this conversation will be non-existent. I also maybe haven't taken notes, you haven't taken notes, physical notes from it, so all we are talking about, maybe some people will take further notes, we don't know, but still, I think from this perspective that even you see in media, even let's say in mainstream media, there are huge problems about current events. Like, we do not know the truth about them, whether terrorists or not, whether these people or these people, how this happened, how this collision happened, how this murder happened. So imagine if we know so little about current times, how little we know about ancient past, how little we know about prehistoric times. So one, I think it's just that not plenty of things survived. It's natural. Not plenty of things survived thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. They erode away, and not everything is archived, recorded, whatever. But the other thing is what you say, that things that are uncomfortable are being destroyed, and narratives are being changed, and things that we do not like, maybe we hide them, maybe we suppress them, maybe we destroy them, or maybe we completely change how they truly appear to us. We change the story basically. So I think it is a big case, and that's why I'm a big believer, and that's what I'm showing with all I'm doing. I'm not showing you, okay, everyone is a fool because they don't believe in lost history and lost civilization. No, and I don't claim that, oh, I know how the pyramids were built, I know how this were built. No, what I'm showing is I'm showing basically the possibilities, that we do not know much about our past, that there are so many things that are unexplored, mysterious, both when it comes to history, both when it comes to the entire universe, both when it comes to physics, science, biology, whatever, spirituality, the biggest mysteries of our own existence. I want to show that. You see this example, you see this example, you see this example. This may, at first, when you learn, let's say when you start learning about something and you learn, oh, this theory, but when you start going deeper and deeper on a particular topic, you see, okay, this is just a theory. It may be correct, but it doesn't mean that it is the true answer. Or maybe it seems correct, but it's based on little evidence. Or maybe it sounds correct, but this is against that and this is against that. So I'm just showing possibilities when it comes to everything.
Right. And I'm kind of curious, as we talk about like knowledge being encoded in ancient text, and I'm going to use, hieroglyphs and stone carvings in this example. I look at some things that I've witnessed with my own eye in the ancient world today and look at it, and I can't help but think either our history is completely wrong about ancient times in this region, or this region had time travel. And the reason I say that is the temple in Abydos. There is a glyph high on the ceiling of a helicopter. Clear as day, no argument. You can't say no, that's a reed that just happens to look like a helicopter. It's a helicopter or a submarine, or in other words, they have modern looking glyphs that are.
Actually, even if I'm, let's say, a believer in lost ancient tech, I believe there was something more advanced before. I want to say to you that the Abydos glyphs were debunked plenty of times, and these are not helicopters, submarines, and basically how we can do that. We know that two consecutive pharaohs that ruled at this time and used the Abydos temple, it's like two names of them intersected. So let's say there was Seti this, and then the later pharaoh came and he destroyed parts of the glyphs and carved his own name on that. And that's how these hieroglyphs that look like submarines and helicopters appear. And we know that because basically you see, just let's say if I write down or carve in stone Alexander, my name, and I carve Michael on top of that, and we can trace that okay, these are two both on each other, and let's say with Michael with CH and Alex with X, it will create something that looks like helicopter. So unfortunately, this example was showed how and why it
Okay.
appeared.
Okay, I can agree to that, and I can see that. But what about in, I think, is it Crete? I'm not 100% sure on the island where they have a stone archway that has dinosaurs carved into it.
Yeah,
And
that's a
as
mystery
far as
still.
we know, dinosaurs and humans never lived side by side. So, how do they have imagery of a dinosaur?
Yeah, it's in Cambodia, Taprom Temple in Angkor Wat, and it is a mystery because, and okay, it can be, let's say, rational, skeptical. You can say it is just a fantasy of our ancestors. The same, for instance, this is just an example, but if you read Mahabharata or other ancient text, you see that there is technology described there, that there are things that are out of this world, spiritual, let's say, like remote viewing, astral projection, and stuff like that. And the skeptics will say, okay, it is just a fantasy of our ancestors, because let's say they imagined that. But then you see it's similar in this case to a dinosaur. Maybe it is connected that they had dinosaur. Another skeptical, argument on that would be that they excavated dinosaur skeleton, and that's how they knew that just as we today excavate dinosaur skeleton. But I don't know, but this example, it's still a mystery because these are just interpretation. The fact is that there is this glyph, and just as in the case of the helicopter, you could say, okay, these are two names on each other, and we know these names, and we know historically that these two people were rulers, one after each other. So in that case, you could, use this argument. But here in with the Cambodia, with this looks like a Stegosaurus, you still see plenty of possibilities, plenty of interpretation. Whether there were dinosaurs among human beings. Maybe there was time travel. Maybe they had like some very ancient memory of the dinosaur. Maybe it's just fantasy for ancestors, or maybe they excavated a dinosaur skeleton. So these are still plenty of possibilities.
Yeah, and there's, I also look at like along the lines of, encoded knowledge, Nazca, with having a monkey or a spider or the astronaut glyph that's seen only from space or from the air, I should say, to be correct. How could they design something that's not in their region and in such a way that they leave no mark behind that says, oh, like here's the footprint, that somebody made, or here's the cut mark, that shows, this came from this place. They, as far as I know, have not found anything like that, and they say, that's a great mystery, and it was just by happenstance we discovered it because we were flying over and noticed, hey, there's an astronaut guy. And I'm not saying, they made an astronaut. I'm just saying the dude looks like a human form with a dome. So we would associate it today with like a NASA astronaut or a cosmonaut. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how those glyphs got created in a place where, in a time frame that was not around.
I think these are possible to be made, let's say, by primitive human beings, but still, why did they do that? How did they do that? We have no evidence as for now. There are theories, but I've heard plenty of different theories, both from mainstream academia and alternative history, ancient astronaut theories, etc. But none of these, in my opinion, is very compelling still. So Nazca lines are another kind of mystery. That okay, these are possible to be made by primitive human beings to some extent, of course, but why, how? And I think that there are and there will be plenty of mysteries that maybe we won't even be able to figure out without time traveling. Because if you time travel, you can see, okay, I time travel to times where the Nazca lines are created, and I see how they do that. But without that, if there are no evidence left because they got destroyed or they were like never made at all, I think this will be still a mystery. But I'm not that heavy on Nazca lines. I think that there are like better examples, as I've told, with megaliths or with different myths that are very similar to each other and point to the same kind of story and to the same kind of lost civilization of Atlantis.
And I can agree, and with that, and how many mysteries that can be discovered by going back and re-looking at. But it begs the question, like, you know Nazca lines, we don't even know when they were made. We haven't been able to pinpoint down even like a range. So how, if you could go back in time, how would you just keep going back randomly and then go, oh, there's the point. Okay, yeah, now they're this point. Or would you just keep waiting and going to other places to try and determine, okay, where can we get a better point of reference? But then on top of that, I also wonder if the human nature of wanting a mystery, of the unsolvable, keeps us from seeing the reality right in front of us and blocks our visions from saying, okay, here's what happened, here's when it happened, mystery solved. Well, we're out of mysteries now. Will our insatiable need for a mystery keep us from ever solving everything that's around us?
I don't think so because you see plenty of skeptics and how they are operating. They say there is no mystery. Plenty of atheists say there is no God. Plenty of people that are materialists, naturalists say there is nothing more than matter. There are plenty of positive people about science that we know almost all the laws of physics and we are at the end of science. So there is a possibility to not have and live without any kind of mysteries. And I think you're right that being too much into mysteries can be actually our downside, that we are not taking the truth into account, and I think it's a huge problem. But I also think in case of how modern world, because okay, on social media or in just private stuff, lots of us are conspiracy theories, lots of us are, let's say, connecting the dots and are into such mysteries. But when you look at the mainstream, when you look at what is official, official is almost without any kind of mystery. And that's why I'm a big proponent of mystery and of what I'm doing. Because if everyone on the, of course, professional level of scientists, academics is doing this kind of thing, maybe if I do the other stuff also, we can do much more together. Maybe we can be much more efficient with discovering the truth about reality. So that's why I take this position of the mysteries, because I think that right now the big problem is plenty of people feel that life has no meaning. They feel that it's all worthless, that there is no like bigger picture to everything. And I think that in such world that it's becoming to some extent, maybe it's better in the last few years, it became better, but in the world where there is like just mediocrity, when there is only atheism, naturalism, there is no deeper meaning, there is no deeper mystery, I think there should be also a voice that can say otherwise, that they say that there is a mystery, or there may be at least a mystery, and that we should pursue. We should go both ways. I'm also, as you see, a little bit skeptical of some claims, of some things, but I'm also a proponent that we do not know everything, and I think that maybe we can never know everything about our past because just the evidence won't survive. So that's my take on that.
Right, and I know we're getting close to the hour and a half mark, and I had a couple of questions that I'm curious your perspective on from a metaphysical and conscious background, and that is when we look at history and we look at information that's recorded, we have come to learn now a lot of history, unfortunately, written by the conqueror. So they're going to make their history their way. And that was done in ancient times to current times. So when we sit there and we say, Romans wrote about this, Greeks wrote about this, and they were there, so they're the experts. We had to take their word for it. And Plato being, along the same lines, how do we account then for what if they skewed the story? What if they altered the story to fit the time frame they're in? And so therefore, can we truly take all these ancient texts verbatim and as expert witness material?
That's basically the criticism of the sources. This is the basis of historian. Right now, I started studying history, and criticism of the sources is the basis of all history. And it's not that we are taking that, oh, it is all good that this ancient source told us, and oh, this is all good, or this is on the other hand all bad. We try to check, for instance, we have material evidence which is direct from some kind of, let's say, layer that we can sometimes date, sometimes not. So let's say modern history is fortunately not like in the past. In the past, it was mostly about textual evidence and okay, this is probably right what this historian said and wrong what the other said. But right now it's also about material evidence, about evidence from different branches, like let's say biology, and we see okay, was it right? And we check, for instance, the skeletons, what people ate. And if it was really, let's say one historian says, oh, this period was period of abundance, there was plenty of food, etc. But then we see from this period skeletons that are completely underfed. And you look at different kinds of demographics. Okay, poor people may even in times of abundance be a little bit underfed, but the royalties, why are they underfed? Okay, maybe they had anorexia or something, but if all the people are completely underfed and they lack vitamins and their bones are very bad, and then the historian says, oh, it was very, there were plenty of food, etc. We can double check that and we can say that he was probably wrong. So it's not only about the text, text plays still a big role, but also about the material evidence, the materials like what people of day to day used. But still, these materials are, as I've said, only like a few percent of everything that survived our times. These are just a fraction of everything that was there. But yes, we use, as I say, the criticism of the sources is the basis even of modern academic history.
Right. And I appreciate that. And, you know, thank you for that, viewpoint. And my next question kind of goes into something that I've started to realize is going on in this world. And that is, let's say we look at, for example, mythology of the Greeks. And they say, oh, Apollo rode a chariot through the sky. Well, we look at it as okay, we have this guy with flying horses and a chariot. Well, can we take that example as fact that that's really what he's flying, or was he flying on a UFO craft, as we would call it, an unidentified flying object, not meaning like spaceship from outer space, but flying a craft? But in ancient times, they don't have the word airplane or craft, they have chariot or horse. So they're saying the story in the language they understand and know. So when we're reading these stories and we, don't look at it in the ancient verbiage, is that, in your opinion, lead to a lot of confusion and why a lot of people, start to create the quote conspiracy theory because they're looking at it and going, wait a minute, if they didn't have this word, how would they describe this? And so is that proof that this existed or not? And so when you're looking at text of the ancient, and interpreting, encoded knowledge, do you look at it from the source of what was the language and knowledge of the time, or are you looking at it in modern and trying to say this is what they were saying?
I think you should do neither, because if you interpret everything from the modern perspective, everything could be even why chariots were not cars. So I think you should be, skeptical of both, and you should just go where the connections, where the evidence leads to. What you did with this kind of, okay, Apollo had a chariot, maybe it was UFO, it is called rationalization of myths. So basically, myths tell you that, and you try to rationalize, okay, how God Apollo could have had a chariot in the sky. It's impossible, so we rationalize maybe it was UFO. But for instance, it's connected to Atlantis because in the same two dialogues that Plato writes about Atlantis, Timaeus and Critias, he provides an example of how he rationalizes myths, because basically the story of Atlantis is that Solon went traveling to Egypt, and in Egypt he meets temple priests from the city of Sais, and these temple priest says, "Oh, Solon, you Greeks are like children." And he means that on both level of history, that the Greeks, and he provides an example that the Greeks have only a few hundred years of history, and it's true, and then the Egyptians have records of much older, thousands of years of history. That's why the story of Atlantis happening 9,000 years before Solon meeting with these priests. But they also provide a mythological example. They say, you're also like children, Greeks, because you believe in these stories, and they provide another very similar story to yours, but they provide a story of son of god Helios, so the sun god, and this son of Helios, Phaeton, takes a chariot, and he cannot steer because it's his father's chariot, and it's like, again, a flying chariot, and he burns lots of earth when he's driving this chariot because he cannot, tame the horses. And they say, you Greeks are like children because you believe these are the stories of God who burned the earth with his flying chariot. And they say these are natural events. So basically like a comet, like some kind of asteroid impact. So this is another kind of rationalization of myths. You rationalized flying chariots with UFOs, and ancient Egyptians in Plato's story rationalized flying chariots with natural phenomena, like these are comets, these are asteroids, etc. So there are plenty of stuff like that, and I think that it's not that easy. Okay, only interpret it in that way, only interpret it in that. I think it's much more complicated, and when you go and analyze everything, connect all the dots, then you can see, okay, maybe it's that. And I think in particular cases, maybe you have two different myths, and one is very UFO-like, but the other similar. You say, wait, this is similar to the UFO myth, but it's not a UFO, it's a comet. So I think it's much more than just interpreting everything from modern perspective or the ancient one.
Right, and I appreciate that, and yeah, and I guess where I'm trying to comprehend is, when we look at like ancient texts, like I have a friend who reads the Bible and he interprets certain events through the zodiac and is like, okay, yeah. And then it helps to make the story make sense because, like, Shepherd in winter with his flock of sheeps. Well, sheeps don't go out in the fields in winter. So how is, a shepherd out in wintertime with sheep? But if you look at it through the zodiac, oh, that makes a whole lot more sense. But then again, it's like, I don't, it's like, am I rationalizing through a means, and I'm looking at, this source now skewed through a filter instead of what's really going on. And so, how do we look at ancient text, and how do we look at ancient knowledge and not skew it and just learn from it by what it is and understand what it's telling us without filtering?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, and I think that there may be even a possibility that these are metaphors, these are encoded in some way, but what if we are never to be able to decode them? What if this knowledge about the meaning was completely lost? Let's say right now I imagine a story that I want to encode in a myth, and I write down the myth, but I never leave you a clue how to interpret this myth. It's only my interpretation, my stuff, and I never told anyone about that. Would you be able in the future to decode the myth that I created? Probably not. Maybe you would find out the way how I encoded it, but I think that there is still a possibility that we will never find what these myths truly went. But I also think that when you research lots of possibilities and you go not only within mainstream and not only to the other extreme of conspiracy theory, when you are balanced, when you take into consideration all the possibilities from all the sides of the spectrum, then you sometimes feel like this inner feeling like eureka of scientists and inverters that you finally probably cracked the code. And I think that still it's a matter of how much knowledge we have and how much we learn, we read about stuff, and then we can finally see that, okay, maybe, and I don't claim that I cracked this code, but maybe you read so much, then you see, wait, there is the same code in all of the myths, in all of the texts, in all of the legends. I think that to some extent, I mentioned this code of the Matrix. I have entire presentations, but it's too much. It takes like 1 hour to explain that. But I feel that I cracked some of the code. Like only, I always say it's a tip of the iceberg because it relates to universal stuff, to mathematics, to geometry, to the ratios on Earth, in the solar system, and it's almost everywhere in the ancient world. But it's only like one piece, like a fraction of all the code. And maybe we'll never crack the entire code of the ancients. Maybe we will. I don't know. And I think that's how I think about these topics.
And so, since, we were talking earlier, with like your book and how it's only available in certain places, it's not available everywhere.
It's on Amazon. The English version is actually available Amazon, like US, UK, Canada, Australia, like most of the biggest marketplaces. I think also a few Europe sites like Sweden, Germany, but it is in US. It's Deja Vu Surfing already been. I have links on my social media. I always tell people ask where they can find me. Just copy and paste my name and surname and wherever you will find me in English, because I have also Polish social media a lot there. But wherever you'll find me in English, you can trace both my book, Deja Vu Has Everything Already Been, only on Amazon's, but worldwide. And you can find me in plenty of other places, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, plenty of other interviews like today's one. I think it was like so many stuff, such a like long journey. It was like, I would say, adventure, like this mythological adventure of a hero's journey to some extent. And I think what was
Yes.
great today is that we were both mystical, both mysterious topics, and both rational and both analytical and both things that we can explain and cannot. So thank you.
Yes, and one last thing I want to ask, if I can, because the title of your book, Deja Vu. What was it that made you want to pick that title and look at the world as deja vu?
Not only historical stuff, but also my own experiences about having a deja vu and things happening again. But basically, my book is, I would say, in 80-70% about lost history of humanity, lost civilizations, megaliths, ancient texts, and stuff like that. But this 20 to 30% is about cyclical history, repeating history, cyclical times, cycle, both on the physical level and metaphysical level, cycles according to our ancient ancestors from plenty of regions of the world, especially the Hindu people, the zodiac cycles and stuff like that. So that's why deja vu has everything already been. And also because I compare it, as I've mentioned the first chapter, I compare everything to the modern kind of scenario. What would happen if nowadays there was a cataclysm and we had to start anew when it comes to civilization. So that's why deja vu has everything already been. So has everything like civilization, like all the myths, all the legends, all the metaphors, all the scenarios, like movie scenarios, which are very universal, and universal themes are the has everything already been, and all like opinions, like modern kinds of skepticism that isn't skepticism at all, or like modern things denying things. So that's why has everything already been.
And that's beautiful because it reminds me of the adage that I heard growing up, and you probably heard it as well, is you have to watch your past and your history because if you don't learn from it, you're bound to repeat it. And then there's the other part of that saying of watch your history because everything is repeated in history. And so it begs the question, have we learned? Or are we all still stuck and we haven't learned, and that's why we constantly are repeating? So I'll leave that thought with
That's a
everyone.
great question, and if anyone wants to find the answer, I actually tackled this question in my deja vu in the last chapters after the entire journey through lost civilization, lost history, pyramids. Then I try to find out if we learned. Because if we learned, why are we repeating the same cycles? Maybe we are still repeating these because we need to still learn about this stuff.
Yes, and so I'm definitely going to put that probably on the top of my wish list or even order it today. And
Awesome,
so
thank you.
thank you. And Alexander, before I go, I want to leave you with a message that I feel is really something for you on a metaphysical spiritual level, and that is from my heart and the heart of my shows to you. Thank you for what you're doing for humanity. Thank you for being you, and thank you for being authentic and open and sharing.
Thank you, thank you. I try to live by what you said. Like, no, they say do like that. No, I will do what I feel is the right way. Thank you again. It was a great, amazing conversation. Live stream, actually.
Yes,
Unfortunately,
and
we haven't responded. There were so many questions, but I don't worry because from people from my chat, I will be talking soon with Tyrone Robert of the Word. So we'll talk about
not
this stuff.
and yes, and thank you. And I'd love to have you back on, and I will try
We will
and
crack the matrix code next time. And
yes,
probably go into cyclical time because it's connected actually to the cyclical time.
that sounds like a great
So
plan.
remember,
And
I will try to remember too that we should go this route.
yeah, I'll make a note to myself, and when we schedule, I'll be like, yes, we're ready for this part two and the continuation of the adventure. And I love how you pointed out, our conversation ended up being an adventure because in the beginning I said, join us on this adventure today. And we ended up actually going on
Synchronicity.
one.
Synchronicity. Yeah.
So thank you and have a wonderful day and rest of the week. And keep in touch and blessings to you. And thank you to everyone who watched and participated with this and shared your ideas. And with that, I am going to say good afternoon. I almost said good night because I'm used to night shows.
Yeah,
But
it's good night here. I will say good night. Thank you, you too, and thank you, all the listeners, all the watchers who were watching us.
yes, and with that, we're going to say bye bye, everyone. Okay, here we go.